Good day, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we will be discussing the aquaculture species in the Philippines. So, basically, we will deal on the most important commercially cultivated species in aquaculture. So, to start with, let us first distinguish the different species that are now cultivated in the Philippines. So, here we have the definition of terms for the three classifications of the species being cultivated in the Philippines. First, we have invasive or nuisance species is an organism that causes ecological or economic harm in the new environment where they are not native. So basically, we have noted different species that are now being cultivated, but yet there are also species that causes harm to the native species or what we call as the endemic species in the naturally growing in the waters of the Philippines. So again, invasive meaning to say they are not native in that particular area and they have caused ecological damage or harm to the new environment that they are introduced. And secondly, we have the term exotic or introduced. This term refers to the species that is non-native. It is introduced into an area where does not occur naturally. So basically, they are exotic or they are foreign species. The introduction of these species may be deliberate or accidental. It is not always considered to be nuisance or invasive. So, unlike invasive, these exotic or introduced species are non-harmful or did not cause any harm to the introduced area, although they are both non-native. Okay, so the only difference between introduced and invasive is that the introduced do not cause harm, while the invasive had caused harm to the introduced environment. All right, so lastly, we have the term endemic and indigenous. This refers to any species whose range is restricted to a limited geographical area. So, meaning to say, these are basically the species that are not found in any other places. Like, for example, the native species or the endemic species of cyprinids found in the Lake Lanao, basically, they are not found anywhere else. So, basically, they are endemic in Lake Lanao. Right? So, those are the very basic definitions of the three classifications of species that are now being cultivated in the Philippines. Now, the first and the most common species that is basically helping the economic of the fisheries industry is this milkfish, or scientifically known as the Chanos. So milkfish or the Chanos is the earliest aquaculture species introduced. So milkfish aquaculture first occurred in around 800 years ago in the Philippines. And it was in 1979 where milkfish hatchery development by the Southeast Asian Development Center Aquaculture Department. So they have created or developed the milkfish hatchery in Safe Deck EQD. This is located in Tigbawan, Iloilo. So basically, they have cultivated this milkfish in 1979. Now, what are the biological requirements or the culture habitats and units of this particular aquaculture species? So basically, milkfish can be grown in fish ponds in brackish water. It could be either also in fish pens in freshwater lakes and fish pens in shallow base lake based cages, or may it be either fixed or floating. And sometimes they are being cultivated in sea-based cages. So given the fact that these milkfish are considered as euryhaline meaning to say they can adapt in a wide range of salinity. So they are more adaptive to different variety of salinity levels. Okay, so we term that as euryhaline species, meaning to say they could adapt in a wide range of temperature. I mean salinity rather. And then another introduced species is this mosquito fish, or scientifically known as Gambusia affinis. First exotic fish introduced from Honolulu, Hawaii in 1905. They are being used in the Philippines as a biological control. So they are the ones responsible to eat those harmful larvae, mosquito larvae, or any other larvae that may harm our cultivated species. So that's why they are called as mosquito fish. And then another introduced species is the common carp, or scientifically known as the Cyprinus carpio. This is the first exotic food fish introduced in 1915 for aquaculture. So take note of that. The very first aquaculture species introduced in 1915 for aquaculture was common carp, or scientifically known as the Cyprinus carpio. Now, in the Philippines, we have about a total of 62 freshwater fishes were recorded to be introduced in the Philippines for the period of 1905 to 2013. So the breakdown of this one, the 62 freshwater species, is basically shown in this figure. No, 77% of it is or are beneficial, while 16% of them are harmful, or what we call as invasive, and while the 6% is potentially harmful. Potentially harmful meaning to say they were not being recorded yet to cause harm in the natural environment, but they have the potential to cause harm. So basically, 48 of the species are beneficial or non-harmful. 10 of the 62 freshwater species are harmful or invasive. Four of them are can be considered to be potential invasive species. Again, invasive are the species that cause harm to the aquatic environment. Now, another species that were non-native to the Philippines that were introduced for aquaculture are the following. First is the channel catfish, or the Ictalurus punctatus. This species is catfish from North America. And then, of course, we have the very common tilapia, or niloticus. They are not from here; they are from the Africa. And then another is a crustacean species, the giant freshwater prawn, also known as the Macrobrachium rosenbergi. They are from Indo-Pacific region. And then we have the saltwater finfish species called as the largemouth bass, or the Micropterus salmoides. This is also from the North America. So these are all now being cultivated in the Philippines, but they are not naturally endemic here in the Philippine waters. So they are considered to be introduced, but they have successfully helped the economic of the Philippine fisheries industry. And then here we have another introduced species who which significantly contributed to the fisheries production of the Philippines. First, we have the very common tilapias, mainly the Nile tilapia, or the Eurychromis niloticus. And then this one, of course. And then we have the carps, the particularly the big head carp, or the Astictias nobiles. And then we have the catfishes, the Garipinus, Aclarias garipinus, and the Pangasius hypophthalmus. Although these are the Pangasius is not very yet commercially cultivated, but they have the potential to help the fisheries industry, because they are these kind of species do not need a very what do we call this pristine environment that could meet their biological demands, no, because these species are considered to be sturdy meaning to say they are, or they could tolerate in a not so friendly environment. And then we have the four famous Asian carp. So these are the four famous Asian carp that significantly helped the aquaculture industry in most countries, particularly in the Southeast Asian countries. So among the four major famous Asian carps are the silver carp, or the Hypophthalmitias mulitrix, the big head carp, or the Aristictias nobiles, and the grass carp, or the Tenoparingodon nidilus, and the black carp, also known as Myoparingodon pecius or Piscius. Right? So those are the four famous Asian carps. And then we have the four introduced species that became invasive. No, As mentioned earlier, not all species that are introduced are invasive, but there are also introduced species that may cause harm, and we call them as invasive. Now, among them are these four: the Clarias batrachos, or the native Southern, Southeastern Asia, um, and has been introduced to many places for fish farming. During the drought, large numbers of walking catfish may congregate in the isolated pools and consume other species. They are known to have invaded aquaculture farms, entering ponds where they prey the fish stocks. So basically, because of their what they call this, their pelvic fins, pointed pelvic fins, basically they could walk in dry environments, and it could also live in I mean, say they could invade in ponds by digging and entering the ponds and uh, eating those being cultivated species in your aquaculture ponds. And then among of the introduced species that became invasive in the Philippines is the Chanas striata, or the madfish. Once the young fry becomes adults, they begin to hunt on their own, feeding on the other adult species. And the progeny of those fish, they can also feed on frogs, snakes, insects, worms, tadpoles, birds, and small mammals, as well as crustaceans. When the food sources become limited, the adult snakehead may feed on their young own species. So that's very unlikely for a species not feeding their own youngs, no? Especially when they get too hungry. So basically, this is locally known as haluan, no? If you're familiar with haluan, they are basically the most sturdy among the invasive species known in the Philippines, because it could live even in a dry bottom. Uh, Despite the long sunny or summer days, this species could still live. They just have to burrow themselves in a mud. Okay, so that makes them very dangerous. And one reason why you have to let no in the pond management, one reason why you have to let the pond crack before you water them over, it's because there are times that this particular species is still there, and it may eat your stocks upon stocking uh, nan- if this particular species is still living in a dry land. And then another finfish species that became invasive is this Mozambique tilapia, or the Orychromis mozambicus. This may be a possible threat to native species, though the competition for food and nest space. Juveniles have been documented to feed on the other fish. Tilapia are now generally considered as pests. So basically, they because of their piscivorous in nature as well, they are considered as invasive. Piscivorous means to say it's a kind of fish that eats other types of fish, or other or similar fishes. And then lastly, the Asian swamp eel is scientifically known as Monopterus albus. They are predators that are active at night, feeding on many different aquatic species. Prey species for Monopterus albus are fish, worms, crustaceans, and other small species. So basically, these are the four introduced species that became invasive in the Philippines. Now let's proceed to the mollusks. Let's start with the bivalves and gastropods. So we have here the bivalve, um, oysters and mussels. 1901. It was in 1921 where farming of oyster started in Negros Occidental, employing the broadcast method of culture. Broadcast method basically is just a traditional method of growing oysters, no? So it started in 1921 in Negros Occidental. So take note of that. And then account for the largest production of mollusks to aquaculture. So basically, the oyster accounts the largest production of mollusks through aquaculture. And this is very familiar, or this is very prominent in areas of Panay, Aklan, and some other areas in the Central Visayas. And it was also in 1962 where farming of mussels started. No, most of the farm mussels are include the brown mussels or the Modiolus metcalfe. It is the most widespread mussel species in the Philippines. Among the cultivated mussels are also green mussels, which are basically the ones that is being now the directions of the national fundings, especially in the OST. They have a lot of projects involving green mussels. So these are the common bivalves or the oysters and mussels being cultivated in the Philippines. Now, among the species of bivalves and gastropods being cultivated, not just the mussels and oysters, but they have also the clams, no? The clams, the scallops, the abalone, and cockles. So these are also promising commodities for aquaculture because apart from they just need a very less water management or aquaculture management practices. They could also, or the food that they need is just basically naturally growing, or you could grow them your uh, you could grow the food in the nearby aquaculture area. No? Well, the oyster accounts for the largest production of mollusks to aquaculture among the other bivalve species. I hope you are all familiar with the oysters, mussels, clams, scallops, abalone, cockles. No? Oysters are basically this one. Mollusks, mussels are this one, and scallops or clams are this, and this is abalone, and this is the giant clam, and these are cockles. Right, so those are the common species of bivalves and gastropods being cultivated in the Philippines. And one of the um, perhaps you could explore your local fishing grounds, because in Malimono we have observed lot or bunch of what do we call this, juvenile abalone, no, juvenile abalone in which they could serve as a source for a wild stock of abalone if you're targeting abalone aquaculture. So these commodities are promising, especially if the stocks or the seedlings are available in the area. And then we have here the cultured species of mussels in the Philippines. Again, mussels like brown mussel, green mussel, Philippine horse mussel are being cultivated in the Philippines, although not very commercially produced, but they are being cultivated. And then we have here other bivalves, cockle, scallops, carpet clams. So these are very important mollusk commodities that have a promising future in the aquaculture industry. And we have here the crustaceans, no? The crustaceans basically culture of pinnate shrimps in brackish water ponds is as old as the culture of milkfish. No? This is it has started a way back in 1951. No, um, among the cultured pinnate shrimps or the Penaeus monodon or the jumbo tiger shrimp or the black tiger shrimp, as the others call it. And we have the Penaeus indicus or the white shrimps and banana prawns, the Penaeus merguensis, as well as the greasy back shrimp or the Metapenaeus ensis. And just recently, most of the aquaculturists are now also cultivating Penaeus vaname or the Lithopenaeus vaname. And it was in 1951 where monodon became the very primary species for export of the Philippines. No? In fact, we have been in the industry where our main export commodity is sugpo or the monodon. No? But because of the very um, irresponsible way of culture, most of the aquaculturists were practicing very intensive farming, applying antibiotics, and it has caused occurrence of diseases. and therefore it reached to the point where it had to collapse, no, collapse because of irresponsible aquaculture practices. And then we have here the global farm shrimp production. So this data came from the shrimp panel estimates from the National Fisheries Institute. So basically from 2008 to 2018, and we are among of the top producers of the farm shrimps. No? So you could just take a look at this and which country does contribute the highest shrimp production in the world. Obviously, it's China. And then here we have the jumbo tiger shrimp, the Penaeus monodon. Jumbo tiger became the Philippine topmost marine export earning in 1992. So as I have mentioned earlier, we became the top exporting country for monodon. The ill effects of pushing production to the limits using high stocking densities had led to the diseases like the occurrence of luminous vibriosis. So if you're familiar with the luminous vibriosis, these are basically a disease that is caused by luminous vibrio, particularly mga Vibrio harvey and Vibrio splendidus, if I'm not mistaken. So these are basically very harmful pathogen that cause the collapse of the sugpo industry or the monodon industry. So there. And then going back to the crustaceans, no? In 1960, mud crab or mangrove crab culture in the brackish-water ponds started. No, in the 1960, most of the cultivated mud crabs are being fattened and already grown, but emaciated crabs and growing half-grown crabs. No, not basically purely cultivating, but just they just capture wild crabs and then they allow it to grow in a controlled environment. And it was in 1970 where larval rearing started in the Philippines. Uh, but the larval rearing is sporadic rather than sustained. The problem is that survival rates are low and inconsistent, and also that because we could not get sufficient or enough source of larvae of this one. Given also the fact that crabs only have 2% survival rate, so basically this is very difficult to sustain this kind of species. And among the crab species in the Philippines are the Scylla serrata, the Scylla olivaceae, Scylla paramomosane, and Scylla tranchybarika. So basically, these are the four species now being cultivated in the Philippines, especially in the Seaf Deck AQD of Iloilo. And then here we have the very familiar tilapia, also known as the St. Peter's fish or the aquatic chicken. The reason why it is called the aquatic chicken is because um, this type of species do not need a very tedious way of aquaculture management. They are considered as sturdy kind of species, so you just have to leave them around and then throw foods at them sometimes or oftentimes. So they are considered as the aquatic chicken in the aquaculture industry. Endemic to the Middle East and the sub-Saharan Africa. They have three groups, namely the Auricromis, Pterodon, and the Tilapia. So these are the three groups. And then the Auricromis mosambicus is the first tilapia introduced in the Philippines from Thailand in 1950. It was in 1960 where the use of monocytic hybrids was developed, and it was in 1970 where the progress of freshwater aquaculture started. No, and it was noted that the fast-growing Nile tilapia is the Auricromis niloticus. The introduction of monocytic culture was also eventually developed in the early 1970s, while the genetically male tilapia fingerlings are also developed. and artificially produced males with YY chromosomes are also commercialized. Now, the reason why the industry tends to divert their attention to the male tilapias, it's because male tilapia grow faster than the female, because the female tilapias can use their energy to reproduce, and while the male tilapia just basically use their energy to grow. So that's the reason why aquaculturists tend to develop or prefer male tilapias over female tilapias. And then with regards to the aquatic plants, no, the seaweeds, farming of seaweeds in the Philippines started in the late 1960s. The importance of seaweeds are basically, so some people or most people enjoy it as a food, no, yung mga lato, guso, and etc. etc. And seaweeds also are are very rich or are very popular with their hydrocolloids, no, they are a source of hydrocolloids. Now, hydrocolloid is a water soluble carbohydrates that are used to thicken or increase the viscosity of any products, like sometimes these hydrocolloids are imparted or are the ingredients of toothpaste, shampoos, soaps, and many other hygienic materials, no, or hygienic products. And then it was first discovered from reed seaweeds in 1958 in Japan. So basically, there are lots of products that you could produce out from the extracts of seaweed. And in fact, some of the extracts are now being also cultivated or now being utilized as a form of antimicrobial agents to fight against pathogenic diseases in aquaculture. And then here we have the global food hydrocolloid market share. The source is 2020 2030 from the persistence market research. So basically, you could see here that lots of the hydrocolloids came from plants, accounting for 36.4% in the year 2020. And it was projected that in 2030, this percentage will still remain at at large, no? It would somehow increase at 4.8%, no? Ang sources of hydrocolloids among the raw materials that they are taken from. And here we have the seaweeds, the type of seaweeds and algae. There are basically 10,000 kinds of seaweeds in the world. There are three main groups based on pigmentation. So again, please take note that the groups or the three main groups of seaweeds are basically classified according to the pigmentation. For the green seaweeds, we call them as chlorophyceae, accounts for about 1,500 species in the world. And for the brown seaweeds, we call them as phaeophyceae, about 1,800 species. While the red seaweeds are the rhodophyceae or the rhodophyta, accounts for about 6,500 seaweed species. Big difference between the groups is the pigments that they have in their cells. So that makes them color green, brown, or red. So again, the pigmentation. And then here we have the commercial seaweed species being cultivated in the Philippines. So among of which are the Eucuma, Capophycus, Glyceraria, Color Palenticipira, Codium, and others, Codium porphyra, and Sargassum. So basically, these are the species being cultivated in the Philippines, may it be either as a source of food or as a source of hydrocolloids or extracts. And sometimes they are being cultivated because some of the commercially important aquaculture fish need them. Like for example, the Gracilaria uh, is needed by the abalone. So some of the aquaculturists have to grow, or the abalone aquaculturists have to grow Gracilaria along with their cages of abalone, because Gracilaria served as a food for abalone. And then here we have the giant freshwater prawn, also known as the Macrobruchian lucinburgi. This is defined as the large catadromous prawn native to coastal rivers and estuaries of the Indo-Pacific region. Now, it was introduced in the aquaculture in the Philippines in 1970s, and it is the only freshwater species of prawn currently reared commercially. So this is a very important one, especially those areas that does have a very remote access to the sea, no, to cultivate very high delicacy na mga products like for example ang mga shrimps. So itong Macrobrachium risenbergi. And in fact, some of the natural environments or natural streams and rivers still have this Macrobrachium risenbergi being caught from the wild. And going back to the finfish species, the rabbitfish and spadefish are basically now being commercially cultivated. In fact, some of the aquaculture industries demanded by the government are now diverted to the production of the sigonids and the rabbitfish and spadefish. Species cultured in some brackish water ponds and marine fish pens and cages in some parts of the Philippines. Rabbitfish or the spadefish, they are the low trophic level species. Low trophic level species meaning to say they do not need very they are basically the species that do not rely on high quality of feeds. No? They are the two fast grower species of siganids are known to be the Siganus guttatus and Siganus vermiculatus. The Siganus guttatus have already a hatchery developed in Sifde. And then lastly, we have the Seabass and Groupers. The Seabass and Groupers are basically carnivorous species. They are considered to be a high valued species. No? Constraints are that this kind of species are high cost of feeding because you have to grow tilapia in order to feed this particular species or any other um, low quality type of fish or some refer to them as trash fish, no? But the constraints is that in the Philippines there is no practically trash fish that you could consider in order for this high quality type of finfish to be grown. Okay, so more or less those are the commercially cultivated species in aquaculture in the Philippines. If you have questions, you may reach me through our group chat, and perhaps you could read the Google Classroom. I have posted there your requirements. So again, I hope to see you again in the next video, and thank you guys for watching.